As we learn about missionaries from the past, we're going to be learning about how people lived in the past. And some of those stories will make us uncomfortable. We'll realize that people did not, and probably still do not, always live the way God intends for us to be living. So as we hear some of these difficult things, we can be asking ourselves, is this what God intends? And how does God want me to be living? Well, tonight we're learning about Betsy Stockton. Betsy was born around the year 1798 as a slave in Princeton, New Jersey. And when Betsy was only about 5 or 6 years old, she was taken from her mother and given to Mr. Stockton's daughter Elizabeth when she got married. Now, Elizabeth married a pastor, Dr. Ashbel Green, who eventually became the president of Princeton University. Betsy remained a slave with them, and finally, when she was about 20 years old, Dr. Green started paying her for her work. He allowed her to be baptized, and he allowed her to go to college. And this was so unusual back then for any woman, and certainly for a former slave. But Betsy had shown herself to be an excellent student, and her favorite subject was the Bible. Well, when Betsy was about 24, she felt God calling her to be a missionary. And she became the first single woman and the first African-American woman to become a missionary to Hawaii. Back then it was called the Sandwich Islands, and people didn't get on airplanes and go there for fancy vacations. In fact, Hawaii wasn't even part of the United States. And even as a missionary, Betsy wasn't treated the same as other people. Her fellow missionaries were told, don't treat her as an equal, nor as a servant, but as a humble Christian friend. While she was there, Betsy was asked to be a teacher, and this was unusual because Betsy had not received any training as a teacher. Her first students were the children of the tribal chiefs. But Betsy looked around and she wanted all of the children to receive an education. And so she asked the chiefs if she could teach the farmers' children. Oh no, they said, that's against the law. That's not how we do things here. But Betsy kept praying and Betsy kept asking, and soon she was allowed to teach all of the children. And then Betsy taught Hawaiian adults how to be teachers. And within 4 years, 8,000 Hawaiians had received an education because of Betsy and her way of teaching. Well, around this time, some people in America and in Europe were starting to question, do missionaries even belong in Hawaii, changing their ways of living? But one of their top leaders, the equivalent of our prime minister, wrote, give us literacy, meaning the ability to read, and we will teach it. Give us the word of God, and we will heed it or obey it. You see, the Hawaiians were loving learning how to live God's way. Well, Betsy dedicated her life to becoming an excellent teacher for all students. In time, she eventually went back to the United States, and unfortunately, in America and in Canada, the best schools, and sometimes the only schools, were for white children. So in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Betsy started a preschool for black children. She and one other helper started with 46 2 to 5-year-olds, and by the end of the year, they had 115 students. And the city leaders realized that she was an absolutely excellent teacher. Betsy got to return to the mission field. She went to Canada and started a school for Native American children. And then she returned to Princeton, New Jersey, where she spent 30 years teaching at the only public school for black children. And when members of her church, the white members of her church, no longer wanted black people to worship with them, Betsy and some of the other leaders started their own church, the Witherspoon Street Church, and she became a Sunday school teacher there. That church is still meeting today, and in it is a beautiful stained glass window dedicated. It says it's presented by the scholars of Betsy Stockton. You see, Betsy had taught her students that no matter where they came from, no matter what they looked like, no matter what other people thought of them, They had value in God's eyes. They had the same ability to learn and be excellent students, just like everybody else. So Betsy was born a slave. She was separated from her mother as a child, but then she gained her freedom. And she used her freedom to serve God in her community. Betsy's love ran deep for all people because she loved God and all of his people. Children, what will you do with your freedom?